Hello everyone, my name is Seher. Me, Karina, and Myra worked on the project regarding use of personal protective equipment among Latinx migrant agricultural workers during pesticide handling and acute pesticide-related illness. Agricultural work is considered dangerous work. Every year, 19.4 per 100,000 deaths occur in the USA due to agricultural related injuries. Besides other occupational hazards in farming industry, pesticide handling may lead to several health consequences, both acute and chronic, for workers who come in close contact with pesticide and their families through secondary exposure. Many agricultural workers work without proper personal protective equipment or PPE, which increases their exposure to occupational hazards, including pesticides. Each year, around 10,000 to 35,000 incidences of acute pesticide related illnesses happen. Acute illness constitutes symptoms that appear immediately within minutes to hours and of short duration, lasting for a few days to a few weeks. Among all farm workers, the Latinx community represent a high proportion of the agricultural workforce. According to the data, 47% workers are Latinx in this industry, and one data suggests that around 44% are unauthorized. Though it is really difficult to estimate unauthorized workers due to their unique legal status. Before handling pesticides, workers are required to get training mandated by EPA. However, one survey done in California, which is one of the largest employers of migrant agricultural workers, found that 25% of migrant workers didn't receive any pesticide related training. Among people who did receive training, 21% didn't understand what they learned, which makes 46% workers vulnerable to pesticide related health consequences due to lack of proper training. Many Latinx workers, if not severely affected, don't seek medical care or report their employer for non-compliance due to the fear of retaliation. Considering that many Latinx agricultural workers do not have access to proper pesticide training, which they understand, we wonder if accessible training model leads to a decrease in incidences of acute pesticide related illness. To assess the impact of such intervention on Latinx migrant community, we will investigate available surveillance data, our surveys, and field observations in West Coast states, Washington, Oregon, and California, and test the hypothesis that the availability of PPE and accessible information regarding its proper use would reduce the number of acute pesticide-related illnesses among Latinx migrant agricultural workers. Based on our literature search, we created a system diagram to find various elements and leverage points for intervention. Acute pesticide-related illnesses, the migration status of Latinx farm workers, inadequate PPE training, and relationship between employers and workers create a complicated system dynamic. Acute pesticide-related illness happens due to increased exposure, and several factors are responsible for it. One of the biggest and the most complicated one is the exploitation at work. These migrant workers are susceptible to exploitation for several reasons. Their employer-bound visa, unauthorized status, and lower socioeconomic conditions create an environment where workers may not be able to ask for their rights or proper PPEs, and they may not have access to proper training for handling pesticides. The visa status for new immigrants or seasonal workers are employer bound. They are afraid of retaliation from employers who may terminate their employment, and they may not be able to find another employer and arrange a new visa on such short notice. Unauthorized workers have additional fear of deportation along with all other factors. They are exploited to work for lower pay, and in many situations, wages are tied to productivity, forcing workers to work without proper PPE, which could otherwise reduce their productivity. This work exploitation leads to a vicious cycle of pesticide exposure, poor health, poverty, and further exploitation. It is a complicated situation because the solution involves government regulations and properly implementing those rules and regulations. The other important leverage point we identified is access to proper training. Our literature search found that many workers either don't receive training or don't understand the training material. Language barriers, illiteracy, or cognitive disability are some factors that affect access to proper training. This factor could lead to either increased exposure or delayed medical care because if the illness is moderate to mild, they don't realize the cause of it and wouldn't seek medical care in time. That could lead to poor health. And again, that vicious cycle of poverty, work exploitation. In this complicated system, there are several other important factors where out of pocket medical costs and secondary exposure to family could lead to further poverty and exploitation. Some of these leverage points require further intervention through legislation, which is a cumbersome and lengthy process. Changing training materials and teaching models and mode of teaching could improve the morbidities and mortalities associated with pesticides among Latinx agri workers while staying in the same system without further legislation.
So for our conceptual model, our decimal determinants are Latinx migrant workers who are associated with increased risk of acute pesticide-related illness. Another one is the English language communication and comprehension challenge, which many of them have migrated or immigrated from a Spanish-speaking country, thus creating that language barrier between English and Spanish, between farmers and the workers. Another one is low wages and job insecurity. Many of these workers work in very harsh conditions but get little pay, thus creating job insecurities, including exploitation as previously mentioned in the slides. For our proximal determinants, there is a lack of PPE availability in these farms or fields that these workers are working at. Or another one is improper or no training of PPE usage. So there is a connection between the language barrier and the training of PPE. If someone is training them in English and there's like a language barrier between English and Spanish, so these workers won't know if they are being trained because for the use of PPE. Another one is PPE avoidance due to productivity loss. Many of these workers would decide not to use those PPE because it decreases their productivity, thus decreasing their wage. So to avoid that, they decide not to use it at all so they could increase their productivity and get necessities that they need for their families. And another one is air drift, which is accidental exposure from neighboring field or farms. So for this, we decided to do an intervention and hands-on training for these agricultural workers in Latinx community in creating animated videos and pamphlets in English and in Spanish. The animated videos, we decided to do that because many of these workers may be illiterate. They never taught how to read or write when they were little due to financial barriers that may have caused when they were little. That way, doing these animated videos will help them visually see the importance of using PPE usage. And our goal is that after 1 year, workers would increase their understanding and knowledge of PPE with overall decrease of acute poisoning. So for our study design, we'll be doing a randomized control. Our participants will be Latinx workers in West Coast states. The participants will be comparing training between the control and intervention. Those in the intervention will be doing a training through accessible training model, and those in the control will be doing training through a standardized model. The beginning months of the study will be doing baseline data from self-reporting surveys, field observation and pesticide surveillance programs, and then from there do a follow-up in 6 months. And we're doing a randomized control to measure the effectiveness of the training models between the control and intervention. And our goal would be, as mentioned, is to increase proper use of PPE and reducing the acute pesticide illnesses. For inclusion, we have named a few on our list, including Latinx, migrant agricultural workers, and native Spanish speakers, and 18 plus, to name a few. And those in the inclusion would be those who are fluent in English, are permanent residents, and those who are younger than 18 years old.
There are limitations, complexities, and considerations related to acute pesticide-related illness. The limitations include developing a shorter time frame, such as a 6-month study, to accurately accommodate our target population. This is due to the temporary status or seasonal work of participants in the inclusion criteria. For this reason, we had to choose a time frame that is more realistic. Another limitation is part of the data collection is self-reported. Also, PPE use may differ when participants are observed. This is concerning because it may be different from reality and participants may use it incorrectly at other times. Complexities related to acute pesticide-related illness include production-based pay creates multiple challenges. PPE reduces productivity, therefore it can be inconvenient. Lower productivity reduces income. Another overlooked complexity is the status of migrant workers. They may be reluctant to speak to outsiders, government, or authority. It is hard to research this population, and they have a valid fear of deportation. Some considerations include that there are limited studies available in the U.S., specifically concerning PPE usage and pesticides related to Latinx workers in West Coast states. To address the limitations and complexities we found in our research, we determined that future research must increase study on migrant workers. Qualitative research on PPE use in the Latinx community, highlighting challenges and perceptions of work conditions. Also, chronic pesticide exposure to Latinx children and migrants. To conclude on acute pesticide-related illness, there are some key insights we would like to share. These include acute pesticide poisoning and lack of proper PPE use are associated. Vulnerable populations do not seek help due to fear related to status. When equipment is provided, PPE use increases for Latinx workers. There are also multiple language barriers that create disparities in training. Training is mandatory, yet populations still do not receive training or receive inaccessible ones. It is not considered that people in this population may be illiterate, material may be in English or written in Spanish, and this is not enough. This leads to workers being unaware of pesticide symptoms and lack of proper PPE usage. The barriers migrants face as agricultural workers can include exploitation and lack of healthcare access. Research shows that acute pesticide-related illness and PPE use affects the Latinx population the most, and they make up a large portion of the workforce. This slide shows the references we used for our research and where we gathered information. Thank you.